Hello, everyone, and welcome to the live webinar on rethinking risk in age of climate change, organized by AXA ahead of the upcoming Foresight report. So I'm Olivier Desbiey. I'm heading the AXA Group Foresight Team. And today we will focus on discussing the impact of climate change, long-term transformation, and possible pathway to 2040, and the role the insurance industry can play to anticipate and to adapt to these changes. We have a great lineup for that, with Deborah Bolk. So Professor Deborah is the director at the City University of New York at the Institute for Demographic Research. Deborah is also part of the New York City Climate Panel and AXA Research Fund Fellow and awardee. Thank you for being with us, Deborah. We have Greg Lindsay. Greg is the director of applied research at NewCities, a global non-profit organization committing to shaping a better urban future. I love actually this mission. Thank you for being with us, Greg. Andrew MacFarlane. Andrew is the head of pricing and analytics for Reinsurance at AXA XL and a partner on AXA XL's leadership councils. Thank you for being with us, Andrew. And last but not least, we have the luck also to be with Scott Smith. Actually, Scott will be our moderator today, but he's also the founder and managing partner of Changist and author of the How to Future book. And just for me, the opportunity to mention that we benefit from your methodological expertise when building our new report. So just maybe prior to enter to the discussion, I just want to say a few words to explain the intent of this webinar. With the current situation, we are experiencing an unprecedented degree of both complexity and uncertainty. These two elements are the raw material for doing foresight. What we learned so far from the current situation is that when change happens, it can happen fast. So it is important that we keep looking forward to anticipate and to consider possible futures. Considering future potential events is part of the core business of the insurance. It is true for the insurance in general, but especially for us at AXA. Actually, it's now even embedded in our new purpose, Act for Human Progress by Protecting What Matters, where this reference to progress underlines the importance to pay attention to long-term transformation and related challenges that our societies are facing. And this is the role of foresight as a tool to explore and understand ongoing transformation to better navigate uncertain times. So now, coming back to this foresight exploration, since 2019, we, the Foresight team, published a report on an annual basis. Last year, it was on mental health, unfortunately a premonitory topic. And this year, we have chosen a broader scope and a long-term horizon that are reflected in the title of our upcoming report, 2040, Exploring Society's Future Challenges. The idea is to identify pivotal challenges to arise in the two next decades in three interconnected areas: the environment, socioeconomics, and health, and to highlight the role insurance might play in the society of tomorrow. This is a real foresight document, I hope so, in the sense that we describe possible vision of the world in 2040 through scenarios, not prediction. And to give you a bit of the flavor of the document, we describe a future with the growing needs for social protection, where the effects of climate change are a reality based on a 1.4 degree raise in temperatures, leading to stronger market regulation, and where health is more holistic, mixing the body and the mind, in reference to our previous foresight report, and more focused on prevention and definitely tech and data-driven, questioning the role and responsibilities between the different stakeholders, public, private players, and individuals. In a nutshell, our main conviction is that future challenges are likely to be multidimensional or hybrid, and will require even more trust and cooperation between all economic and societal players. And of course, insurers have a role to play. For example, as a catalyst for green investment to build a more sustainable world, as an economic stabilizer, maybe making even insurance product more inclusive, and as an orchestrator in the health system. To introduce our today's discussion, I finally want to mention a last point. Our intent is still to question possible futures with an S and related threats and opportunities in order to be prepared. We do not want to provide ready-made answers, but rather stimulate thinking and opening line of reflection. And we are convinced that one way to do that, just as we did in the document, is to bring and mix various disciplinary fields and perspectives. And today, we have that with futurists, academic, and insurance experts. So thank you one more time to join this webinar. So Scott, I leave you the floor to run the discussion.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Olivier, and thank everyone for joining us today. Actually, I think we've got not only a kind of distinguished panel in terms of different disciplines and experiences, but also locations. I'll talk about that in a moment, but it's a privilege to particularly at this moment in time, to talk about the challenges, but also the opportunities the next 20 years may bring, but in climate and the built environment, and in the changing role of insurance, as you mentioned. It's a privilege for us and for me, for my colleagues, and that we were able to work with you in the past year, a challenging year, as you put this together. So it's wonderful to see the work kind of go the full arc from beginning to this conversation. As you mentioned, it's a foresight exercise, so this gives us a chance for structured, constructive speculation and provocation to stimulate thinking. As you said at the opening of the report, the goal is to inform thinking about avenues of progress and to stimulate action towards a sustainable future. So I think this is a great platform for that today. This could easily be a full day discussion, given who we have collected here today. But we only have the remainder of this hour to try to kind of skim across the surface and hopefully open up some issues and topics for you to think about and to dive more deeply into. I'm very pleased to have these three distinguished panelists with me, joining from Montreal, from New York City, from Bermuda. I'm in The Hague in the Netherlands. The AXA team here on board with us is across France. So it truly is a global panel, and we'll be hoping the global networks can hold us up as we go. If you wouldn't mind actually dropping the city or location that you're coming into to this webinar from in the chat window, we'll have a look at those and see just how global the conversation is. A word about format. So we're going to take this in a couple of blocks. Over the next few minutes, I'm going to actually turn to each of the experts on the panel in turn and get their initial responses to the report. They've had an opportunity to read it in a preliminary sense and kind of get their thoughts from the perspective of their professional point of view. And so we'll be talking to them in turn and then turn it into, or sort of open up to a group discussion and group conversation that I'll be moderating. That will take us for another probably 25 or 30 minutes. But in the meantime, what we'd like for you to do is, if you have questions that come to you during the discussion, please put those in the Q&A window, which is separate from the chat window. You'll see it on the bottom bar here on Zoom. And Gabriella and Olivier, the AXA team, will be collecting those. And as we get to the later part of the conversation, they will select some and pose them to the group. So hopefully that will take us through till the end. There'll be a link at the end of the session where you can hit a QR code and download a version of the report or go to the website to see the digital version. So without too much more detail, I would actually like to, I'm going to sort of start at there's probably a debate as to who has the biggest picture view. I think everybody has a big picture view and a different side of this system. But I'll kind of go foresight first and turn to my esteemed colleague, Greg Lindsay from NewCities in Montreal. And Greg, welcome. You have a many-faceted background in terms of the topics that you look at, not just in terms of urban issues, city transformation, mobility, technology. All these things, of course, are intertwined. But also, you come at this as a futurist and sort of person with a foresight lens as well. So I'm curious, kind of, for your initial reflections and thoughts on the forecasts in the report, the scenarios as they're represented, and yeah, like what struck you about it?
Well, all right. Thank you for having me, Scott. It's a pleasure being here, and thank you all for joining today. Before we get into my thoughts on it, I would encourage all of you to read the report and download it, because true to form, when working with Changes, there are great Easter eggs in it as you read the design fictions throughout how they sketched out this world. Dubai, Africa is one I'd recommend in particular. But yeah, in my work, I mean, I lead the Higher Ground initiative at NewCities, where we sort of look at climate migration and also work with the Future Map team on their sort of climate oases project to sort of map these out. And my initial take on the report is once again, great product from Changes in the AXA crew on mapping out multiple scenarios. It's not just business as usual, and it's also not just wish casting utopianism. I think you guys have done a great job of sort of sketching out the various trajectories there. When it comes to sort of risks and emerging risk section that comes out of sort of the survey, I was surprised. Well, yeah, somewhat surprised. Always people are looking back to the last risks and not ahead to the first. I think the biggest missing piece there is sort of migration and thinking through about people crossing borders under climate. Which I'll come back to in a moment. But since you privileged me to let me go first, I get to be the one to quote Bruce Sterling's one sentence prediction of the future, which is old people in cities frightened of the sky. And I think you capture that in the various variables here of environment, socioeconomics, and health. The combination of urbanization, demography, and climate change there, and what that leads to. So I think you captured some of that in there for sure. In terms of again, this being AXA here, how do we use insurance in the markets to basically put a value on sort of all what was previously considered externalities, and basically design new products, and how do we harness that? And again, for those of you just reading the report for the first time, you can read about the groundbreaking climate initiative reached in 2036 to sort of encapsulate all of that. But going back to what's missing, in my own work in this area is, yeah, I mean, I'm very focused these days on sort of the migration aspect. I mean, the pandemic, again, isn't going to recede from us, but I think it's really interesting to see various cities and nation states right now are in the sort of competition for global talent. We've had a natural experiment in governance, and I think that's one of the things that the report gets into. Will we, continue to pursue, private market interests? Will we see a renewed focus on institutions and build new institutions to meet the challenges of climate change? Or will we see continued deterioration in trust in the performance of those institutions? And people have had a chance to look around the world and see who's handled the pandemic well. I'd like to think that this will be a signal event that we'll see a reinvestment into those institutions and capacity to solve these problems. And if not, we'll see the elites of the world flee, migrate, escape to the places that do that. Or, we're seeing across the world, for example, Helsinki, Estonia are competing at one end, arguing that you should move there because things just work. At the other end, you're seeing various locales like Miami, which is almost the most obviously climate threatened place in the Western Hemisphere, I would argue, at least in the global North, is now becoming a attraction point for venture capital and others moving there for the weather and low taxes. So it'll be very interesting to sort of see how people respond to this. And I'm saying Andrew's joining us for Bermuda, which has also become a haven and offering itself as a safe spot for that. So that'll happen at the high end. And then I'm, of course, very concerned at what happens at the low end of this, the global South, the people who do not have actions and strong passports. What happens to them and how that contributes to socioeconomic challenges and geopolitical risks. For example, I worked with the New England Complex Systems Institute and some of their work to basically to establish causal links between drought, social unrest in Syria, the Syrian civil war, and of course, the waves of migrants that nearly destabilized several European governments in 2015. How do we establish those risks? How do we prove those sort of patterns of causality and then basically intervene at the appropriate points? That's something we're still, I think, all grappling with. And I think the kind of solutions proposed in this report here about how do we put appropriate risks, how do we structure financial products or ban certain ones as related to carbon that will prevent this in the future. And then finally, I guess just sort of a point on method here before I pass it along is, I think the report does a particularly good job of also sort of sketching out the contours of what this future looks like. We're all still trying to grapple with what a world of climate change will look like. And this report assumes that there will be, of course, warming, and there will be, of course, these changes. And some of my own work for the Regional Plan Association in New York City, we imagine the coast of New York and New Jersey in 2067. And we imagine that the state deterioration continues. They have to sell off public goods in some places. spaces. We see, also an investment in building new urban districts and creating new, more livable environments in response to this. There is an opportunity in all this. And I think the report addresses that well with the references to the 15-minute city and how do we create, more livable environments that are also better suited to an aging population whose health has already been damaged by the pandemic. So I'll pause here, but those are some of the challenges that we need to look at. And, and again, this report does a great job of helping sketch in the details and the contours to help us realize what it will take in terms of governance and cooperation between public and private sectors to make this a realities.
Thank you. That's, you managed in a very quick fashion to touch on a lot of the kind of important threads. As you can see, this is not a simple it's not a simple picture to look at. I think climate and environment are, probably amongst the greatest critical uncertainties that we faced when we're doing qualitative forecasting and trying to develop qualitative scenarios. And this report, of course, as you'll see if you get a chance to look at it, looks at a couple of those big variables like cooperation and growth and how those come together. But you touched on issues of migration and kind of demography, which I think is a great segue to Professor Balk. Deborah, it's wonderful to have you here and to kind of bring your perspective. You've had experience on the quantitative forecasting and modeling side of this as well. I'd be interested to kind of hear your point of view from where you both research and practice as you're connected with NPCC in New York City. And yeah, sort of find out what you took away from the material.
Great, thank you. Thanks for having me. And just picking up the baton from where Greg left off, I'll start with a little bit, first of all, but let me start by congratulating you for the report. I think it's a really great exercise, and I'll be really interested to hear how it's received, how using this sort of scenario style framework for envisioning the future can be become practice in a business community. I think the IPCC, for example, has established the use of scenarios for thinking about alternative futures, but adapting it to at a subnational scale, at a city-specific scale, at a sectoral scale, at a business-specific sort of enterprise is a new construct. And not that you've done everything that's in that framework, but this is well within the bandwidth of those activities. And I think it's a really, it's a great model for other people in the business world to be thinking, as well as in the public sphere, to be paying attention to. And so seeing him, not only the process of reaching out to your stakeholders as part of the process, which was a really key component in developing the report, but also how it gets the reactions to it and how that could perhaps influence the way one thinks about the middle range future. So that's one thing about the report, which it goes out to 2040. And I think even though 2040 seems like in some ways like a really long way from now, especially as we're all on lockdown in some variation in our own homes, but it's before we're going to see the full brunt of climate change upon us, even though we see it already. And so not forgetting that we also want to be planning, finding a way to deal with the uncertainty associated with different time horizons, the very near future, the middle range future, and the long range future. And this was so I really congratulate you on trying to get that middle range future in the conversation. But I think we also have to find ways not to be fearful of thinking about the longer term future as part of the conversation as well. But the middle range future does establish a little bit how the longer term future will go. So that's a really nice thing about this current report. Taking the baton from old people frightened by the old people in the city frightened by the sky concept, I think we can embrace that. We know the world of the future is without a doubt going to be more urban and older. We know that so definitively. Like even with recent changes that may have occurred due to the pandemic, I think that the momentum is strongly behind those forces of a more urban and older world. That's just not gonna, those characteristics, those demographic truisms essentially are not gonna go away. And so we can embrace that. But it can't, it also requires disaggregation. So while cities are getting older, cities themselves also, or urban people, still tend to be younger than people who live around the cities. So tends to be, in fact, outmigration. New York City, where I am, for example, it loses more people than it gains in a net sense. And so understanding how this impacts both population vulnerabilities as well as assets in cities is really important. And I encourage, picking up from Greg's comment on migration, I think we know very, very little about climate migration, partly because we know very little about migration in general. The focus of the academic literature and even the literature in the embraced by the activities of the UN and even refugee agencies and so forth on understanding migrants and refugees has been primarily focused on international migration. And of course, that's very important, but it is just a drop in the bucket. And migration is in fact a very normal process. It's not necessarily a threatening activity. It happens under the course of, at a time scale of month, year, semi-decade, decade. It happens with, there's a lot of normalness to it, so to speak. But it's less predictable in the ways that we're used to in terms of demographic modeling, in terms of, say, fertility or mortality reduction or increases in life expectancy. And so I think we need to pay, and it's place specific. And with that in mind, in fact, the driver between the cities that are going to grow partly because of natural increase in the future, but partly because the recipients of in-migrants from other cities. And we still don't have a great handle on that. And so some of this scenario style framework can think about which cities are likely to be the senders, which cities are likely to be the receivers, or which neighborhoods in cities. And so, for those of us who live in cities that are flood prone, for example, yes, you might see people retreat a little bit from those more floodable areas and to higher ground, as Greg put it, whether that higher ground is manufactured or natural, but it may also be so, but they may not actually be leaving that economic sphere of a given city. So I think this calls for us to think about how we operate and collect data and analyze data in those places. And this will take me to my I have two final points that I'd like to throw into the thing are one on equity, bringing an equity lens. When we open, there are equity requires attention both from a global perspective. Inequalities have persisted from the global north to the global south, of course, are very notable, but also within cities. Cities are very heterogeneous places, and I think we need to examine the equity lens and what that means for our future, without a doubt. And the last thing I want to add on to here is that and I'm going back to one of my first comments, which is that having business as a partner and a leader in this is really important, because I believe that, there's a lot of maladaptive, like public insurance, for example, public flood insurance comes to mind as a maladaptive response in some ways. And so I think that thinking about what as an industry standard can be and metrics used to evaluate those and push those forward, that's progressive and that works toward, also accommodating the tremendous uncertainty, but that's measurable uncertainty in some ways, is an exciting but challenging prospect. And I see that those narratives in the report. And so I think going forward, I'd love to see how those can be implemented, perhaps statistically or qualitatively within industry practice or public-private partnerships.
Right.
Back to you.
So thank you very much. A lot of really, really interesting kind of touch points there as well. I'm just actually looking at the list of cities that people are dialing in from today, and it's pretty overwhelmingly global north, but with coastal exposure in some places. We've got a few folks who are joining us from, for example, New Delhi, but a lot of it is kind of traditional business capitals, which makes it's no surprise, given that we're talking about the business of an industry and what its impacts might be. But I think the issue that you raised around kind of time horizons is really interesting and useful. It's quite a challenge for the team, the AXA team, who put this work together, and anyone who's doing foresight to calibrate those time horizons and to really think about the tensions between them. And so I think that's a really interesting piece that I want to dive into a bit more in the later discussion. Andrew, you've been patient to wait to the third spot. I appreciate it, but you're coming at this from the industry side, and I'm really interested to understand how this kind of presentation or representation of possible futures kind of lands with you. In particular, the challenges that you see around the business model and kind of evolving for the landscape that Greg and Professor Balk have kind of described.
Thanks, thanks, Scott, and thanks to Olivier and team for the report and giving us an opportunity to participate in today's webinar. Greg and Deborah have really sort of given views at a very macro level, and from an insurance perspective, we look at things at a much higher resolution and at a lot more granular scale. Sorry, a much more higher resolution, less granular scale. And so I just want to sort of bring back a little bit to the context of the way we think about risk within the industry and how that then might relate to some of the thoughts and concepts that Greg and Deborah have sort of put forward. So, within the context of a changing climate and the impacts that we're exposed to as an industry, they come into three main headings. Transition risk, as we transition to a low carbon economy, liability or litigation risks, those risks we face, as a result of potential litigation against climate change, and then physical risk, which is really the area that this report tends to focus on, which is the impacts that we will see from changing climate on the built environment. And when we talk about risk and we define risk in that context, I think it's important that we articulate that we see risk as a function of three key components here. The hazard, which is the peril that has the potential to create some sort of damage. Exposure, the built environment, the assets that Greg and Deborah have alluded to that are at risk from that particular hazard. And then the vulnerability, which is the extent to which those assets can withstand the hazard. And the interesting angle here is really how those three key components will evolve over time. And as Scott and Deborah have mentioned previously, and the report goes into some detail, really talking about megacities, the rise of the megacity, the increase in the number of megacities. And it's that accumulation of wealth, that accumulation of assets, which creates an evolving risk for us as an industry. So, it's not just the change in the hazard that we need to be aware of, but it's the change in the change in the exposure and that accumulation of assets in those areas that are exposed to particular hazards. Urbanization, urban sprawl, all those key facets in terms of how that's going to affect the risk that we take on as an industry. And then the other angle is the vulnerability, right? The extent to which technology advancements is going to create ways in which the properties that we live in, that we work in, are able to withstand some of these hazards that they change in the future. And it's important when we're thinking about risk from an industry perspective, we need to think about all those three key components and how they're going to move over time, and not just really focus on one aspect of that risk equation. Deborah made a great point around time horizon there. The report is some scenarios that we have at 2040. I think it's interesting when businesses are run, we tend to look at a much shorter time horizon. It's a 3 to 5 years, sort of long, maximum length of time, 10 years. And how do we sort of bridge that gap between thinking about the way we run our businesses at that time horizon and the societal message that we have around how the climate's going to change and the impacts that we're going to see on the communities that we're all part of. And then lastly, just to sort of touch on an important point which is made, and coming from AXA, the value of insurance that we have, the value of insurance within the economy. I think they use a great phrase within the report, the invisible force that insurance has in the economy. And I think that's something that we need to push on and explore a little bit further in the concept of that value that we bring to the economy. We are there, we put communities back on their feet post-event. And as we move into a potentially riskier and more uncertain world, the extent to which the opportunities that we have to help cover some of those risks and those opportunities, whether it's through new products, parametric products, or natural assets that help with that resilience, or whether it's through technological advances which make digital distribution easier so that we can access a bigger part of the market, or it makes claims handling, policy issuance all easier so that we're in a better position for society. I think we did some work last year with the Cambridge Centre for Risk Studies around optimizing disaster recovery, and coming out of that report, there was the value that insurance has in terms of the speed and quality of recoveries. And so I think it's important that we push that message out, right? Insurance is a big part of the economy, and we have a big role to play in the future.
Thanks. I'm glad that you touched on that. I think the invisible force phrase is one that sort of jumped out at me as well, in terms of thinking about how businesses and sectors can kind of reimagine themselves, or perhaps just kind of re-perceive the roles that they play in markets and society. Here you're kind of playing a really critical role, as you've described, between, let's say, the cities themselves, between businesses, civil society, and how you can kind of play a role in mitigating some of the impacts and establishing sort of components of equity and sort of bringing that into the picture. I want to kind of jump to, and this is actually for everyone, so I'll open up to the kind of broad panel. Thank you all for your individual remarks. Data is something that's common here, and you can't really look out 5, 10, 20 years. Really, you can't look at the present without reckoning with the role that data is playing in both in private industry in terms of technology, how we understand things, how we can map things, but also in the public sphere. We're seeing more things like satellite launches, to be able to collect better data about the environment, about the planet, about urbanization and migration, demography, natural systems. But I'm curious, from your 3 perspectives, what role you see data playing here, and what role it can play given the sources that we can tap and may be able to tap soon to address these issues.
I'm happy to take that one first, if Greg and Deborah are okay with that. So there's already existing work that we have on the go in terms of taking advantage of that data. So if we break it down again to the way we view risk, we can use data, we can use information that we're getting to enhance our understanding of the risks that we take on. So understanding better building attributes, items that are key to providing resilience to particular buildings or properties or assets that are at risk. And that data that allows us to formulate a better view of the risk that we take on and how that might change in the future. I think the interesting angle to look at as well is the improvement that we will see around the science to allow us to understand with a higher level of detail or resolution some of the impacts that a change in a hazard might have in the future. So forecasts that we see around the hazards tend to be at a very low resolution, which is not that useful for us in terms of the way that we need to see the high resolution information to allow us to assess risk. So there's definite values that we can see within aspects of that risk equation that I mentioned there, and the improvement that we will see over time in terms of allowing us to gain that better insights into the risks that we're taking on.
If I may, well, Deborah, ladies first, please.
No. Go ahead. Go ahead.
All right. Well, quickly, I just want to go beyond the data itself to the models and who has access to the models. Like, how is that data being used? So, I mean, obviously, we live in a time of incredible data extractionism, which goes into various black boxes. And when it comes to climate, this is something we worked on at Higher Ground, is looking at the fact that, that for when it comes to so much climate modeling, they're done by various black box services. And so one area that we identified is that, that cities, governments, if they can afford to access these services, then they have some vision into what's going to happen to them. And if they don't, then they're out of luck. And, we basically need to build, some open source public sector alternatives to this for a commonly agreed upon idea of reality, so that data is going into models that can be not only just open to anyone, but also explored and interrogated. So we have a common understanding of what the world is. And, of course, misinformation shows up in the report as one of the risks there, but also just thinking about the fact of, being able to create institutions that can ensure the integrity of this data and the integrity of the models. And again, coming back to design fiction, our mutual friend Julian Bleeker recently proposed that, the United States needs an FDA for algorithms, the FDAA for not just food and drugs, but also algorithmic health risks, and thinking about what they can do. So I think there needs to be some further institution building, and not just, how much more data can we collect, but, who's using it, who should have rights to this data. This gets back into data commons and thinking through other structures beyond simply, as Shoshana Zuboff wrote in an op-ed in the Times about, it's just assumed that data is something that's free in the air, and then you can collect it if you're an entity, and then it becomes part of these private models and private ownership. We need to, I think, drastically rethink what public models of data ownership look like to explore this future together.
That's great. Let me just take that. I'll take that and run with it. So I was going to say that about data, these are the principles that I think have been established, but that we need to really double down on, which is transparency, accountability, and scalability, and an ability to integrate them. So across, increasingly we have new types of data, tracing data, data from one's transit passes and cell phones and other new kinds of data, satellite imagery being used with social science type data. And I don't want to, it's usually these silos which have existed remain relevant. And in fact, like national censuses, I believe, or national registration systems for data collection remain really important. I would never want to get rid of them in lieu of using satellite imagery to try to estimate the population or the characteristics of the population who may be exposed to a given hazard. And in fact, it's really important that countries, national governments, state and city governments all have are accountable and transparent with the data that they collect, and should be encouraged, and where needed should be given resources to help make those data publicly available. I couldn't agree more with the idea that coding should be a part of, like, what goes into a model should be or the code behind a model should be shared. Now, it may be true that, some of these, for example, climate models are in fact really complex, and they can't be rerun so easily by any specific entity, but establishing networks of partnerships. And I do think the scalability of these things are really relevant, because, global climate models are the ones that influence what we think about for smaller regions like cities. And there aren't city-specific climate models, for example. So there may be like an urban focus to a climate model, but so the scalability issue is something that we have in front of us. And part of the reason that's the case is because we don't have some of the data inputs we would want to do that modeling. Some of it is also on the technology side of this, the interface of, what our computational capacities are for these things, but that's changing. Also, we don't, and the last thing I just want to make is on the use-misuse idea. So like, I think mapping and spatial information and transparency with that is really important. But we also need to do a better job of establishing uncertainty associated with it, and to make sure that there isn't misuse associated with especially very fine scale renderings. So all of those are things that but as a community, these are areas that we can do much better on. And in fact, some of the hardest data to get in all of this is the business data. So again, I want to maybe that's a question, but for the AXA folks on what might be the, what do you envision, if I wanted to publicly download a set of assets, or I would have a hard time doing that. Whereas if I want to know the population aspects of the population, I could do that pretty easily. So globally. So I mean, this is the kind of thing. And yes, I could maybe look at road infrastructure, but I couldn't look at other aspects of the built infrastructure, for example, that might be really, really relevant to, say, flood risk. So so I think these are putting this out there is really important. And again, transparency, accountability, scalability, be able to integrate it thoughtfully. Yeah.
No, I think those are quite important. We've done a lot of work over the past decade around sort of public treatment of data as well, and I think those are becoming increasingly critical attributes to be paying attention to. I just want to remind people that if they have a question, there's so many things being kind of touched on in this conversation that it's sure to spur some thoughts and questions. Be sure to use the Q&A window, which is you should be able to see on the lower right. I think there's a red number 7 there right now for questions queued up. But our AXA colleagues will pick those up and ask them in the closing minutes of the session. I actually want to kind of hook onto that last piece. We talked earlier about the invisible force, kind of phrase, and the role that insurance can play across the board, and having different assets. There's a line in the report that talks about how insurers have substantial assets under management and can direct money and resources into projects that promote resilience. And I suppose you could also think of data as an asset. But Andrew, I'm curious for you to elaborate on that a little bit as you see the role of insurance changing, particularly as we kind of move into that second horizon, the middle of the forecast, 2020 to 2040. Have you given thought to what other kinds of roles and assets that an insurer can bring to bear to address the resilience issue more openly and directly, particularly with cities and governments?
Yeah, thanks, Scott. So we've been working within AXA on something called ocean risk, which is really understanding the risks that we are bringing to our ocean, particularly in the as a result of a changing climate. But coming out of that work is the importance of natural assets that we're seeing. So mangroves, coral reefs, coastal marshes, seagrasses, and the importance of those, not just from a biodiversity perspective, but from an economic perspective in terms of tourism, fishing, local fishing jobs, community, but also the resilience that they bring to coastal communities. So mangroves are one particular example where we've been doing a fair amount of work looking at the impact that they have in terms of reducing the impacts from storms. So coastal inundation, sea level rise, and mangroves have been proved that they can actually move back as sort of sea levels rise to sort of create that resilience. So the interesting angle there is how do we bring about the ability to allow for the impacts that we see at a resolution, that we can use that to impact the business that we write, the ability for that to provide some resilience and act as a way for us to reduce our risk. But the other angle is the carbon sequestration. Mangroves are one of the biggest sequesters of carbon. So the interesting angle there from the position where we've got an ecosystem which is not only providing the ability to reduce and sequester carbon, but to give resilience to coastal communities. And so we're doing work in that space to try and assess or bring about a product to market to provide coverage and support if those get damaged, to redevelop and reintegrate those type of assets. So I think there's interesting roles there to play, from just winding back a little bit from just the built environment. So there will be defenses that we will need to build to provide some of that resilience, but thinking back then to the natural assets, given the multifaceted solution that they can provide to us and our communities.
Deborah.
Yeah, so I want to jump in with, I think Andrew's example of mangroves is excellent. And just like the balance between using the connections between the natural and the human environment. And the report pays attention to this, as well as in some of the how to make the world greener component that's addressed in the report. And this comes into play with heat. And I see a question in the chat in one of the Q&As about what do I mean by maladaptive in the context of insurance. And in this case, like I'll give an example from heat. So let's say you're when a heat wave is coming, in New York City, for example, this past summer, when there was expected to be a heat wave and people were quarantined and couldn't use the traditional method of gathering in community centers that are cooling centers that the city often has. And I know other cities around the world have such cooling centers, but the pandemic made that a dicey proposition, and therefore the city went out to put mechanical cooling, otherwise known as air conditioners, in buildings. And of course, that was necessary. Everybody should have access to air conditioners, but air conditioners are, and without a doubt, there's nothing, air conditioning access should be equitable. That said, we should also be paying attention to passive cooling strategies. And some of that comes from the green environment. In some cities in particular, in some parts of cities, like access to green space is not equally distributed. And making sure that we think about, we are strategic about the way we use green space to help keep our urban environments cooler. And I think this is particularly important for cities that are currently growing and growing fast, and for which there may not be public infrastructure to think about such incentive programs. So that's why in particular, I thought that, Andrew's example with the investment in the natural environment, the mangroves, for example, in the coastline, and to help protect coastal assets. Well, the same thing can be said in the urban space, to think about, trees are plantable, right? Or trees don't have to be cut down, or what kinds of trees, and maybe it's not just trees, and the same can be true of naturally occurring flood zones within cities. You may not want to pave over them, and so forth. So I think that these kinds of things. So by being maladaptive, going back to the maladaptive, you want to make sure that you don't put in place like insurance models that allow us to just let the same thing happen again in place time and again. And so that's where the maladaptive piece comes in. We want to be more proactive and building resilient strategies.
Great. I'd actually written that down to come back to. So thank you, Greg.
Well, yeah, just to quickly come back to this, when I think about the role of insurance in this, in when it comes to particularly sort of climate migration in the United States, or where people are moving to, 5 years ago, the then chief economist of Freddie Mac speculated that that we're going to see permanent write-downs of value of coastal real estate in Florida, and of course also the whole moral hazard of national flood insurance and how basically it sort of suppresses the risk. He speculated that you will start to see what will happen when people start to realize the risk there. Will there be a natural pricing of the risk, or the market will understand, or will there be some candy sales and then panic selling? In California, for example, we've seen that basically a failure to build urban resilience, to build more dense housing in the temperate coastal areas, has pushed people into the so-called urban wilderness interface, where their homes are destroyed by wildfires. And then we see the insurance industry there quite rationally say, we're not going to insure your house if you build there again, to which the state of California has stepped in and said, yes, you will. So we're seeing these sort of deformations here between the markets trying to operate as they should, and also governments taking the wrong measures rather than mandating or working to build more housing there. Instead, they're just basically banning it. So we've built sticks, I guess what I'm saying here, but we haven't built the carrots yet. And I'm also curious about, again, what happens when some of this risk, it gets into the hands of the actual, consumers, individuals, voters. There's a startup I'm interested in called Climate Check that's trying to build walk score for climate. So literally, if you're going to buy a house, you can see a 0 to 100 score of the risk there. Once you're confronted with that, if buying the most important asset of your life, will we start to see people rationally not buy in Florida anymore? And then what happens is the systemic risk in the real estate markets. We saw from the, Gary Gensler, who's going to run the SEC, has warned of systemic risk from climate change, not only to the financial markets, but also into real estate as well. So these are the kinds of things that we need to figure out how we can, short circuit that disaster before it happens. Because some of the scenario work I imagine that the next, financial crisis is the climate crisis, is the permanent write down in values that have already happened that we just simply haven't woken up to.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that's we're starting to kind of sense is our job is to be kind of in a role of paying attention to the subtle shifts, and we're already in the past few weeks seeing a substantial shift in the conversation and momentum around climate. Though many people have been working very hard behind the scenes for many years to push that, when you start to kind of have a change in political momentum, that can I suppose turn things around a little bit, but also the shift, as we've just been talking about, and sort of the role that businesses can play and that different industries like insurance can play to mitigate that, to increase resilience, and to kind of rethink it rather than it being a binary of good, bad, shock, no shock. The things that I've kind of learned in this process of just kind of chatting with the folks here on this team is how many roles that can be played to change that. I want to, we've only got a few minutes left, and again, as I promised, we could talk for hours about this, but I also want to go to some of the Q&A that's queued up. Gabriella from AXA team, if you want to throw any questions in from the Q&A, we're happy to have those as well.
Yes, I'm happy to share a question with Greg. Back to you then. We received a question. How do you think the pandemic will have an impact on climate change? So a bit more of detail on that. We are seeing smaller corporate footprint in the cities, less people commuting into the cities, and more people working from home.
I'll be brief. My first question is where that person asking that question lives, because I think that is it strikes me as very U.S. centric there, where I think the U.S. obviously has seen higher levels of sort of urban flight or thinking on this than other regions that are snapping back to previous patterns. But I mean, wearing my urbanist cap, my biggest fear is that we're going to see pandemic-driven short-termism to leave cities, to buy larger homes, to assume that this will be there, and even though commuting will fall in the short run and remote work will rise, we'll still see more people shift out of public transport or active transport into cars, et cetera, and overall rise in emissions. I'm also concerned, that long term, that basically, a shift to this all virtual world of Zoom, where we're going to restore all this video forever. We know there are all reports by Greenpeace and others about the footprint of the cloud, and I worry about how dirty the cloud will get and how exponentially larger the cloud will get, and whether that will begin to offset some of the savings from physical commuting or aviation, et cetera. So yeah, and I guess the very short answer is it's too soon to tell. But I think if we use this as an excuse, in the United States, tends to hate cities in favor of lower density suburbia, I think it could end up being a perverse thing, despite what we saw in the very early days of huge shortfalls. Just one final thought there. In April we saw a 17% drop in global carbon emissions, but we had to basically temporarily destroy 40% of global GDP to do that. Obviously, this is a structural issue, and simply not ever leaving our homes again won't solve the climate crisis. So hopefully we can make larger change.
I have now one question for Professor Deborah. What challenges, so a bit continuing on what has been discussed earlier, what challenges among those that were previously mentioned, gentrification, slums, healthcare, migrations, which one of these do you see trending towards universally shared versus localized?
That's an interesting question. I think that they, I think all of them have threads of shared with common interests shared across the globe, even though, there's this tension between the localization and the local implementation and giving voice to the local actors. The local actors will differ with respect to on each of those, but there are increasing networks of individuals and communities involved in these activities that are finding strategies and creating, gaining greater voice and perspectives that are being integrated into sort of city, state, and local government and governance issues. So I think that, I mean, I wouldn't actually say that only one is, you know, and they're related as well. I mean, the slums and inequality and so forth, like there just are, you know, or lack of adequate housing and other aspects of inequality, access to water, access to, I mean, there are a whole range of issues, but I think they're largely, a lot of these issues are related. And when one takes on a like a vulnerability perspective, I think that is, you know, those are, you see them integrated. I just want to repeat again, one of the reasons I like this report so much is it did engage with, at least within AXA, the people who might be consuming the report, right? Like within that was in the design of the way it was constructed. And I think that process has to be, that model of a process, like cities engaging their stakeholders, and local communities, and full engagement across both public people who work in the civil infrastructure, people who work in community organizations. And I think this is true in every place in the world. And it's not just within cities, it's like cities and their cities and their surrounding areas, whether those be suburbs or small towns and rural areas. Things are all connected. And like it or not, though, it is a lot easier to make the world more connected now. And I think we should embrace that and try to make it work to our advantage.
Terrific.
Maybe a quick final question to Andrew that came up. So Andrew, finally, are we heading concerning insurance and business towards a more preventive approach?
I think from the perspective of what we can see, you know, it spoke about resilience there. We spoke about biodiversity, the natural assets that we've got, the difference that they can make. I think preventative for me also relates to resilient, and I think we will see communities become more resilient. For me, it's how they get there. Is it a big event which creates a step change in that resilience, or is it a gradual sort of move to having more resilient communities? I think I think technology will play a big part in that, bigger understanding in terms of how we can be more resilient and our vulnerability can decrease. I just think for me, it's what it takes for us to get there, and I hope it's that evolution as we realize we shouldn't build houses in certain areas before something catastrophic happens, or we take preventative measures to make sure that structures are resilient before they are impacted by a big event. That would be my view.
Olivier, I think
Yes.
we are at 4 o'clock.
Yes. Unfortunately, we are running out of time, but one more time, thank you so much. It was a very lively discussion as we were expected. So we are very happy with that. But just to conclude, the first thing is that you can have access to the report and some digital futuristic content. We published a link in the chat, and we are going to share also a slide with much more information around that. Coming back also to the question of this webinar, rethinking risk in age of climate change. Indeed, if we think about this question from an insurance perspective, and this is actually what we promote in a way in the report and also in the digital piece I just mentioned, is that the role of insurer can be making most of its knowledge and expertise. There was a lot of discussion today regarding data and risk model. And actually, one of our colleagues pushed in the chat that there was this kind of discussion in some international forum to make data and risk model being openly accessible to public sector and to become common standard in the global south. Other action are also around integrating nature-based solution in risk model, as it was mentioned by Andrew. And of course, if we think about the future and innovation by expanding the use of parametric insurance. So one more time, thank you so much to all the panelists, the experts for being with us. Thank you also for the attendees. We received a lot of questions And I just want to, you have all the information there to have access to the Foresight report and this Foresight exploration. And I just want to conclude by, of course, big thank to you, Scott, for helping us both during the drafting process of the document and today, and also a special thanks to Gabriela from the team, Titouan and Marie, and all AXA colleagues for their support. So thank you so much, and have a nice end of week, everyone. Bye.